living. He met his future wife on a Saturday night. He married her the following weekend. They stayed together until his wife took her last breath 67 years later. He had several children with her, more grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and in his day he was renowned for throwing one heck of a party. But over the years he also learnt a few life lessons, and I'd like to share some of them with you this morning. This is what he said. Try not to take yourself too seriously. He said, never be too good to start at the bottom. Drink orange juice every day. It worked for him. To be old and wise, you have to first be young and stupid. You must be able to forgive even if it's hard to do. Whatever you do, always give 100% unless you're donating blood. Common sense is like deodorant. The people who need it the most never use it. Love is not always easy. Sometimes you have to work at it. And he said this, life is too short. Get busy living or get busy dying. That's some pretty good advice from someone who's seen a lot of life. I am just over 1/3 of his age, and so I hope you'll forgive my presumptuousness or perhaps my youth this morning if I could offer you just some simple life lessons that I've learnt in my short time compared to William Anderson. And the first thing I've learnt is this first life lesson I want to share with you is this. Things often go from bad to worse. Recently I heard a story about a sailor who was the sole survivor of a shipwreck, and he was marooned on a deserted island in the middle of the ocean. And he knew his situation was very bleak. So he built himself a small hut, and he used this hut to shelter from the elements. He stored a few items which he was able to salvage from the wreck. And for months he lived alone in this hut, prayerfully scanning the horizon in the hope that a ship would come to rescue him. But there was nothing. And one day he'd been out searching for food, and he returned to his camp and he found his hut was in flames. The fire that he had been using for cooking had spread, and his hut was just engulfed. And all his possessions, the survival gear that he had salvaged was completely destroyed, and he just stood there in front of his burning hut, utterly crushed by the disaster. Now maybe you've stood in a similar place to that shipwrecked sailor. Perhaps you've lined up the perfect job, the perfect house, perfect holiday, the perfect partner, the perfect opportunity, and then it's all been turned upside down. Your plans have gone up in smoke. Things have gone from bad to worse, and you are staring down the barrel of something you never expected, something you never intended to happen. Well, that was totally true for the Jewish people who lived in the ancient land of Persia. Over the last few weeks, we've been tracking through this biblical story of Esther. And Esther was a young Jewish woman who lived 2,500 years ago. She was a foreigner in a foreign land. And yet she was plucked from obscurity and chosen to be the queen of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. Esther's husband was known as King Xerxes. And he was the ruler of the Persian Empire. There, you'll see it up on the screen. It stretched from Egypt in the west through to India in the east. He was the most powerful man in the world. And as we've unfolded the story over the last few weeks, we've learned that there was a crisis. And it was the second most powerful man in the world, a man called Haman. He had a deep hatred for the Jewish people, especially for Esther's cousin, a man called Mordecai. In fact, Haman was so consumed by his anger that he came up with an evil plan to kill all of the Jewish people and to seize all of their property and their possessions. And so Haman managed to get this unchangeable law passed. And he chooses a date for this ethnic genocide, 11 months into the future. On the 7th of March, 473 BC, Haman planned that every Jewish man, woman, and child in the Persian Empire would be executed. Now you think about that for a moment. The Jewish people had 11 months to anguish over their fate. In fact, last week Kathy asked the question, if we were in their shoes, would we fight or would we take flight? Well, I guess many Jews at the time believed that things had gone from bad to worse. Not only were they a marginalised minority in the empire, but now they had to live in fear of death. There was an official genocide planned that would wipe them out. And so in response, Queen Esther makes this bold move. She fasts, she prays, and she prepares herself to meet with the king. Esther bravely enters into the king's presence without being summoned. This is great risk of her own life. Normally this would be a death sentence, but miraculously the king agrees to see her. He accepts her invitation to a banquet that Esther is going to prepare for the king and Haman. And so we're going to pick up the story when Haman finds out that he has been invited to this exclusive banquet with just him, the king, and the queen. We're going to be reading from Esther chapter 5. If you have a Bible, please open it up or swipe to it, or whatever you've got. And we also put some space in the newsletter if you want to take some notes. But this is where we're going to read from Esther chapter 5, starting at verse 9. Haman's just been invited to this banquet. Haman was a happy man, but when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted all over the other nobles and officials. Then Haman added, "And that's not all. Queen Esther has invited me to dine with her and the king tomorrow." Now let me just give you a quick character analysis of this guy Haman, because there's something going on here. Haman cannot stop talking about himself. He is full of pride, he is egotistical, he is arrogant, and he is very boastful. And perhaps you have people like that in your office. You know, the type of people that they just cannot wait till it's the 10 a.m. coffee break. And they're going to go straight into who they've been hanging out with, what they've been doing, what product they've bought, how important they are to the company, all that sort of stuff. Everything about them. That's a little bit like Haman. He talks about his promotions, his possessions, and all the prestige he has, and it's just like brag, 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 brag. You'd think, though, with all that glory and all that wealth and all that power, Haman would be satisfied. But I need to tell you this, people like this are never satisfied. Despite all the creature comforts, they never are content. Despite all the power and the prestige, they have no inner peace. Haman was not satisfied because one man in the entire empire, one man did not show him the respect that he felt he deserved. This is what he's just said. And then he added, "But all this is worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew just sitting there at the palace gate." So Haman's wife and his friends, they come up with a suggestion, probably just in the hope to shut him up. And they say this, Esther chapter 5 verse 14. So Haman's wife Zeresh and all his friends suggested, "Set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall, and in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king." This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole set up. Now, I probably should point out here, 75 feet is 23 meters. The apex of the ceiling is 4 meters. So this pole is going to be almost 6 times the height of the ceiling. It's about the height of a 7-story building. This is a pretty big pole. This is not just a little pole sitting in a garden. This is a huge pole. This is a big statement pole. And Haman is so consumed by his anger that he orders his construction crew to begin working on it right away, and they're to work on it through the night. But that same night, something else is going on. Esther chapter 6. That night, the king had trouble sleeping. So he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him. In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed a plot to assassinate King Xerxes. What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. You know, at first glance, there's nothing really special about this night. Outside the palace, Haman's crew are busy building a giant pole which he plans to impale Mordecai on. And inside the palace, I'm guessing a stressed king cannot sleep. But let me remind you that just because there is nothing spiritual about this night does not mean that God is absent. And in the silence of the night, God is still sovereign. In the silence of whatever darkness you are going through right now, God is still at work. And this is the second life lesson that I've learnt. Things are not always what they seem. Now, if you've ever been a parent of a small child, you know this is true, right? You think that the kids are quietly reading a book in their bedroom or something very peaceful, and then you think, I'll just go down and find out what they're up to. What you find out is that they've been busy filing in the bathroom. Or you discover that they have discovered the baking cupboard. Or perhaps they've been doing some interior decorating. Or that they've been very busy in the lounge. Or that they're just making a few touch-ups on the car. With kids, things aren't always what they seem. Well, things aren't always what they seem for Mordecai. When you think about it from his perspective, it seems like the king had long forgotten the good deeds that he did years ago. Mordecai had gone unnoticed, unappreciated, unrewarded until this night. And sometimes that's how God works. When it's the 11th hour, when it's the last minute, when it seems like no one notices and no one cares, God steps in and he makes the difference. I love it the way the writer of Hebrews puts it. He says, God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown towards his name as you have helped his people and continue to help them. God sees your work. He sees your labor. He sees your help, your care, your service. He knows what you do behind the scenes. He knows how simply and sincerely you help people in his name. And you need to know this, friends, that there will be a day when you'll be rewarded for your good deeds. Perhaps not in this life like Mordecai, but certainly in the life to come, because God is not unjust. He will not forget the work and the love that you have shown in his name. See, Mordecai was rewarded beyond his wildest dreams. Look what happens next. Early in the hours of that morning, Haman turns up to the palace. He's going to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole. Now remember, the king's had a sleepless night. He's been reading through the archives, and he calls Haman in, and before Haman can speak, the king asks him this question. The king said, "What shall I do to honor a man who truly pleases me?" So true to form, Haman's first thought is of himself. He's so self-absorbed, this guy talks about how much money he makes, how many kids he has, how important he is. And so Haman thinks, this is my moment. And so he begins to list all the glory and all the honor that he believes he deserves. Esther chapter 6, verse 7. So Haman replied, "If the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with the royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. And let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go, 'This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor.'" Esther chapter 6, verse 10. "Excellent," the king said to Haman. "Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested." Talk about in your face. This is quite possibly the most humiliating task that Haman has ever had to do. Haman has to parade the person that he hates the most through the streets of the city. And Mordecai will be riding on the king's horse, wearing the king's robes, and Haman will have to shout, "This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor." I can only imagine those words must have been like gravel in his mouth. But I want you to note how Mordecai responds to all of this. According to the record, Mordecai does not take advantage of this dramatic role reversal. I mean, he could have. He's sitting on the horse, dressed in the king's robes, parading through the city. I mean, he could have milked it, couldn't he? But despite all the injustices that he has experienced, Mordecai is not vengeful. He is not bitter. He did not lean forward and whisper, "Come on, Haman, say it a little bit louder." In fact, according to the record, Mordecai did not say a single word. Mordecai did not speak against the man who wanted him dead. And I think one of the most inspirational aspects of this episode is actually the silence of Mordecai. When a person is promoted to a position of significance, it is very rare that they will not boast of their achievements or that they will not demand the spotlight. Genuine humility is very hard to find in CEOs and in politicians and in professional athletes and in celebrities. But perhaps what's more refreshing is what Mordecai did afterwards. Look at verse 12. "Afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate." You know, it seems like the promotion didn't go to his head. After he's been paraded through the city, after all this glory and honor has been bestowed on him, Mordecai just says, "Hey, just drop me off back where it all started, back at the palace gate." Perhaps Mordecai knew that if God intended to promote him further, God would make it happen. Do you have that same level of trust? Maybe you've been recently promoted at work. Maybe you've been blessed with a degree of popularity or prosperity. The question is, are you still content to be at the gate? Or must you now live at the palace? Do you demand the spotlight, or are you willing to still be in the background? Because how you answer that question reveals not only your character and your integrity, but ultimately your trust in God. Mordecai was content to entrust his future to a sovereign God. Haman, on the other hand, he was not. So verse 12 tells us that after that humiliation, Haman heads home. Now remember, last time he went home, less than probably 24 hours earlier, he was bragging about how great he is. And now Haman returns home and he's just whining about what happened to him. And my guess is that he is the type of person who would blame others for their misfortune. Perhaps you know people like this. When things go wrong, it's never their fault. It's never their mistake. They never see the possibility that God might be trying to humble them, or that God might be trying to teach them a valuable lesson. And sometimes, as hard as it is, that's what God's doing. He needs to humble us. He needs to open us up to His truth. He needs to bring us to our knees so that we can learn a hard lesson. Well, Haman had some hard lessons to learn. This is what happens next. While Haman and his wife were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. Here we go. Next verse. Chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. While they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request?" Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us." "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. The king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then one of the king's eunuchs said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet in his own courtyard. He intends to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination." "Then impale Haman on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Some people would call that irony, that Haman was executed on the pole that he had intended for his enemy. I would call that sovereignty. In fact, this episode demonstrates another life lesson. What goes around comes around. And if it seems like the odds are stacked against you, if you are experiencing injustice at every turn, know that in the midst of all those troubles and trials, God is sovereign. He is still in control. God is a God of justice and mercy, and in His time and in His way, He will bring down the proud, He will lift up the humble, He will punish the wicked, and He will preserve the oppressed. And maybe you need to hear that right now. Maybe your boss has backed you into a corner. Maybe you've been ripped off by a friend. Maybe you're being harassed by someone in your family. Maybe you've been falsely accused by a neighbor. Whatever it is, God is sovereign, and He sees that evil, and He feels that injustice, and He will not let it slide, because He will not let you go. It is true for Mordecai, and it is true for you as well. Listen to what happened next. Esther chapter 8. On that same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. Now, if you rewind several years earlier, you could have never predicted this. The odds were improbable. The circumstances were impossible, and yet God had been constantly working in the background to change the situation. So don't try and convince me that situations we face in life are permanent. You know, God elevated an orphaned Jewish girl to be queen of the Persian Empire. God foiled an evil plot. God changed the heart of a king. And if God can do that, God can guide a nation. God can open borders. He can alter policies. God can influence decisions. And if God can do that, then God can change the heart of your stubborn spouse. God can alter the attitude of your complaining colleague. He can work in your street, in your neighborhood, in your community, in your town. No barrier is too high for Him. No chasm is too wide, because nothing is impossible for God. And if you only remember one thing this morning, remember this: God is sovereign. when it's all said and done, God is still in control. He is still sovereign. Now, you can choose to be angry and bitter about that and see God as some sort of megalomaniac control freak, which He's not. Or you can recognize that out of His love and out of His grace, God guides us towards the path that is best for us, even though we don't always see it like that. Remember that shipwrecked sailor that I told you about earlier? The guy who'd been marooned on the island and his hut had burned to the ground. Well, after his hut had burned to the ground and all his supplies and his survival gear just got up in smoke, he was devastated. He fell asleep on the beach with a really heavy heart. In the morning he awoke to see a ship anchored off the island. The first ship he'd seen for months. And he was struggling to believe his eyes when he heard footsteps behind him and he heard a voice say, "We saw your smoke signal and we came to rescue you." You know, for that shipwrecked sailor, God seemed distant. But the reality was God was still at work, even though He seemed silent. And I wonder if God feels maybe a little bit distant to you sometimes. Does it seem like He's ignoring your prayers? Do you think He's giving you the silent treatment? Let me remind you, friends, that God is not absent. He's not busy with someone else. He hasn't put you on hold. He's right there, willing you, wanting you to reach out and find Him. And if you haven't done that, man, I encourage you to do that today. Because life is hard. Sometimes things go from bad to worse. But in the midst of all that chaos and confusion, God is sovereign. God is in control. Fast forward 600 years after Esther, and we can see God proved His sovereignty. 2,000 years ago, God sent Jesus, the one and only Son of God, to die on a cross. In this event, Jesus took the punishment that we would deserve for our sins. But out of that horror came something of beauty. Out of that selfless sacrifice, we have the opportunity to be reconciled to God. God proved His sovereignty by raising Jesus from the dead and offers all those who would trust in Him life everlasting. This is how the Apostle Peter put it. He said, He, Jesus, personally carried our sins in His body on the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. You know, this morning as a church, we're going to share communion together. And I just invite you to reflect on what Jesus has done for you. I invite you in the silence this morning to acknowledge God's sovereignty. Even though He might seem distant, even though it might seem like nothing's happening, God is still in control. And through Jesus, He is closer than you think. So I invite the service team to come and share communion with us. Thanks.